All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Sean Gonsalves. I am the Associate Director for Communication at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance Community Broadband Networks. That's a long title, and the panel's over. The Community Broadband Networks are our team here. I've got my colleague and boss, Chris, who will be on a future panel, the following panel. But we, and when I say we, I'm using air quotes because I've been there for 5 years, but Chris and others have been tracking municipal broadband and community broadband for just about 20 years. We're kind of like, so our website, communitynetworks.org, is kind of like, I don't know, the Costco of municipal broadband information. No tariffs. It's all free. Great podcast and weekly bi-weekly live stream show. The reason why I bring that up is because one of the things that we really pride ourselves on is tracking the development of municipal broadband. We've got a map that shows where these community networks are in the United States, and Rai, who is not here, our director of research and the keeper of our database, I checked with the other day and said that asked him, how many public-private partnerships are in existence in the United States? Well, our database doesn't capture all of them because, of course, there are public-private partnerships and then there are public-private partnerships in name only. So in our database, what we mean by public-private partnerships are where there is some local ownership involved. And there are 70 in our database. And over the past 5 years, about 5 new networks have come online every year since then. So we've got a great panel with folks that have a very deep experience in this domain. And I can say that anecdotally, covering a lot of communities and talking with a lot of communities that are wrestling with connectivity challenges, public-private partnerships have become very attractive, I think, at least conceptually, to a lot of communities who are very frustrated with, the major incumbents, which is what brought them to this point. And so our particular panel here, we've got you've already met Elliot, the CEO of TING. We've got Christa Shute, who is the executive director of one of the 9 fabulous communication unit districts in Vermont, which you heard a little bit about. We'll get into some later. We've got Jessica Fowler on the end there. She is the business development, vice president of business development at Vivacity Infrastructure Group. And we also have the co-founder and CEO of the Bonfire Infrastructure Group, Brian Hollister. So I want us to spend our time here exploring a bit about public-private partnerships. And I think, Elliot, I think we should start with you. You've worked with localities across the country. I know you're in Westminster, Memphis as well?
Yeah, Memphis is a private partnership.
Private partnership, but Westminster is a public-private partnership.
Colorado Springs is the other public-private partnership. The Colorado Springs utility is about 10% of the way through building out, and that's a pretty big city. People don't realize it's a top 40 population center in the U.S.
Now, I just said that the idea of this has become more attractive, it seems, over the past few years, but is it? I mean, what makes public-private partnerships attractive, both from a private ISP side and from the public side?
See, I love that you're starting there because I guess underlying a bit of where I was kind of exhorting people in the previous is because the idea has always been interesting. There is, I can think of 3 or 4 different cities and towns that have had each, 3, 4, 5 different processes in successive municipal governments that never come to anything. It's so hard to move from the idea to the action. So, starting there is right. It is, it's a fantastic idea. It's even better when you actually can put the thing in the ground. So.
And from the public side, is it that it's the idea that, look, we want to have better connectivity locally, but we don't really want to do it ourselves. Is that it, or in your experience?
No, I mean, don't want to do it ourselves sounds like I'll trust the incumbent to do it. Look, I think that private equity does nothing for free. And you heard me say previously, or nothing out of the goodness of their heart or the goodness of the organ that pumps their blood, whatever it's called. And so there are great financial returns there when it's done well. So, there's an economic benefit, but I really think it's the infrastructure benefit. One of the things, I'm Canadian, as you know, and I see the heterogeneous, kind of water and electricity through communities and, so many small community infrastructure providers. It's the same thing, right? It's the same thing. This is critical to a local community in the same way that water, electricity are. And so that's the way it should be treated.
Now, I want to go to Christa next, but before I do, let me just ask, what are some of the things that you see that works well when it comes to public-private partnerships?
Look, in many ways, what we did with for this group, what we did with Westminster would be more instructive than CSU. CSU is Colorado Springs, a big city. That was a big city process. With Westminster, it was really us and a member of city council working collaboratively together. I got their finance department into a Google Doc so that we could share the financial planning and work it through and then ground that in a contract that worked for both parties. So, it's really just being sober about the whole thing. And at the end of the day, Sean, this is like anything else in life. It is so in the execution. This is not about the strategy. This is all about the execution. There's a lot of small fiddly bits in these businesses. And so you need competent people. The thought of, I'm just going to sort of instant soup it, and there are some partners who treat it like that. I will outsource everything but the spreadsheet. That never works. Yeah. Drew is laughing knowingly at that one.
Now, Christa, you have some experience in this from the public side, I should say, and what they're doing in Vermont is very interesting with the communication union districts. And there are different flavors, I guess you could say, of public-private partnerships. Why don't you talk a little bit about the sort of the unique communication union districts and the different flavors that you've seen among the communication union districts?
You bet. You heard a little bit from Ellie earlier today from Maple Broadband, and I think it's really important to make the distinction that we are a municipality as a communications union district, but we're also a body corporate, which means we're also a business. So it's not quite the same thing as a city because our sole focus is on communications. So there were 10 CUDs. 2 of the CUDs are now NEKCV. So it was NEK Community Broadband with 51 towns, and then CV Fiber with 20 towns that merged together. So we have a 71-town district, 71 board members, and yep, I had a 2.5-hour annual meeting last night, so that was a good time. But they're all very engaged. It's very grassroots, and they're very passionate about the fact that they haven't had service. Ellie talked about 99% not receiving 25-1 in some of her towns. We have 100% that didn't have 4-1 in some of our towns. Like it was that bad. And so we had EC Fiber to start, so they've been around the longest. They originally set up a nonprofit to be their ISP, and that was ongoing. Then the communication union districts formed. When the 9 other CUDs originally started, it was right before COVID. So the world changed pretty rapidly, and our ability to do things changed rapidly, as Ellie communicated. And so each and every CUD had to make a decision. How are we going to get service in this crisis to our people as fast as possible. And effectively, every single CUD issued an RFP. It's required for grant funding. It's required for municipal governance. And in issuing that RFP, some decided ahead of time what their structure would be, and some didn't decide until they got the responses. So of those new CUDs, let's call them, the 9 new CUDs, 4 of them had very high coverage of broadband. So they had very few addresses that they really needed to cover, and they elected to go with the incumbent. So they own the infrastructure, but really they only own the infrastructure at the very end, right? So they can't really use that infrastructure on their own, but for the work with the incumbent. And then they have contractual terms to address other issues. So what we really had to do was really look at who's going to own the infrastructure. And when we looked at all of those grants, it was like, okay, if we're going to put public money in for public infrastructure to do public good, we should own it, right? And so that's what all of the CUDs did. But who collects the revenue? Who controls the pricing? Who decides what type of contract it's going to be done under? What's the length of the contract that you're going to do? What are your options to get out of that public-private partnership? And what kind of services are you going to offer? The other 5 CUDs elected to offer service directly to consumers. Why? Because we can then leverage the municipal bond market. That is a huge advantage because that means that investors get paid more because they don't have to pay taxes. So that was then the development for us, Ellie and I. We chose Waitsfield, Champlain, and Valley Telecom because it was a local provider, 120 years that they had been doing business since the very beginning, and we knew that they would have the same thoughts and attitudes towards community as we did. And in doing so, we were able to get up and running in less than 6 months. We started from 0 in July of 2021, had customers end of 2021. And today we have over 900 miles, 1,400 customers, and around 10,000 passings.
Now, the CUDs, as they've been formed as essentially municipal entities or telecommunication utility districts, essentially, you don't have the ability, though, to levy tax or those kind of things. So talk a little bit about the funding and the sources of funding that you've had to rely on and how that fits into the mix.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the funding was super key. We cannot levy taxes, and the cities and towns that are in our district cannot take on any debt on our behalf. So everything either comes from grants, the revenue you generate, or it comes from doing municipal bonds. So our business models, as Ellie pointed out, our business models are set when we did that first construction grant to provide universal service and had to show that we could get there using municipal revenue bonds. We went out, we got USDA Reconnect grant under 4. We got a USDA Community Connect grant. We have about $145 million in funding across 40 grant sources. So my accountant is it's a big challenge, right? And it's a lot of work. And we have grant sources that sit on top of grant sources. So we have grant sources that pay for the middle mile and other grant sources that pay for the last mile. So it's a lot of work, but it gets the job done. We have the most rural part of the state, and we have the poorest part of the state, and this is Vermont. So I know you guys there's a lot of cities. Most of the cities in here have more people in their cities than we have in our state, right? And 620,000, pretty sure you guys got that beat.
So Jessica, now that we're talking about funding, let's bring you in on this. I mean, well, first you should talk a little bit about Vivacity's role in the public-private partnership space. But what I want you to get to, though, is the funding environment is changing.
Yeah.
And I guess the question that I want you to talk about after you tell us a little bit about Vivacity, is how do you think public-private partnership projects will need to be chasing the money, so to speak, in this evolving environment?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I want to go back to Christa for a second, because Christa has done an amazing job of creating this like patchwork quilt, really, of a ton of funding. I mean, when I first met with her and she told me what all her funding sources were, I was like, oh my God. I mean, that's like a full-time job managing all the funding sources, and here she is doing what she's doing. But anyway, so Vivacity Infrastructure Group is a national group that designs, builds, operates, maintains, and commercializes fiber networks. And that's pretty much all you need to know. We work with municipalities, we work with counties, we work with DOTs, we'll work with private, we'll work with public, anyone who wants to do a fiber network. We started out as this really lovely, and we still are, which is one of the reasons why I joined last November. We started out as a really lovely engineering group out of Omaha, and somebody here I was talking to is from the Midwest. I can't remember. They were like, yes, everybody always says we're so nice in the Midwest. It's true. But we've still been able to carry that through. So we're working with communities. When I came into the picture, so I started with an internet service provider back in 2019, 2020 called Lit Communities, became Lit Fiber, and then, is now no longer part of the picture. But I've seen so much change. I started as an elected official in Connecticut, and now that was back when nobody knew what fiber was. They thought it was something you ate for breakfast, and you had to sit there and try to educate them. And now here we are, and here I am in a room with some of the most intelligent people, and I'm overwhelmed. It's great. It's just wonderful to see the progress. But I think when I came into Vivacity, I mean, obviously it was before we knew that a lot of federal funding was going to go, but I've just over the past 6 months, it feels like the funding is a black box, and it just keeps getting smaller and smaller, and the edges are just becoming really clear to us. So one of the things that I started to do was I need to track down alternate types of funding. I mean, so it's great to be able to connect with Brian Vo from Connect Humanities, who's here, and just, figure out how is he addressing this. But one of the things that I was thinking about for our current clients and our prospective clients is, how do we find sources of funding and partners that we might not have necessarily thought of before? And we've already mentioned some of them today. So looking at water systems. Water systems are a critical piece of infrastructure. We all know how electric utilities can be, absolutely fantastic to jump on the pole and get on, and you've got your network already laid out. But there are so many co-ops, electric co-ops out there that don't necessarily want to add on internet or broadband connectivity as part of their service, and that's fine. So I think we need to really explore some of the other utilities that exist out there and see if there's any way to start working with them. There are new technologies that will allow us to deploy fiber through water systems, not necessarily new, but they're starting to gain momentum. I think that that's a really critical piece to start looking at. So that's one other piece. I look at the whole renewable space and the whole electric grid space, and I keep thinking, how do we, of course, I'm thinking for my business, I'm thinking, how do I match us to what their needs are? But I keep thinking, too, how do we match them to what the needs of a community are? So I have a client right now in West Virginia. Thanks to ARPA did a lot, by the way. Thanks to ARPA, he's been able to make a ton of awards, and he's now probably has a small number of serviceable BSLs that are left, or BSLs that still need to be serviced. But I look at him, and now I don't know if anybody's following, and I'll shut up in a minute, sorry.
No.
Now, I don't know if anybody's following, but West Virginia has just come out with this very interesting piece of data center legislation. So, thank you. Yes, for excellent coverage on that, by the way. But, they have, basically, it's a Wild West for data centers in West Virginia. So if you want to start one, call me. Okay? I've got you set. But no permitting, very, very little regulatory oversight. I mean, it's just phenomenal. But how can I take all of the interest that's going to be coming in for data centers and try to match that with, let's just say, that community that I'm working with and say, hey, maybe you can come in and do this, but would you mind servicing, 800 BSLs over here and maybe 200 over here? So just trying to come up with some creative ways to make it attractive for some of these new partners to do the right thing. And then there's state revolving funds. I mean, I'm just looking at everything, and I'm still a newbie. There's a million people in this room who know much more than I do about finance and funding, but I know that I need to track it and I need to understand it better for our clients.
Well, certainly the ARPA money has been
huge.
has been flexible, I should say, in comparison to what you see with BEAD. And by the way, ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, not the early part of the internet. Let's bring Brian in. Brian, you're with Bonfire. You're co-founder there. You have worked with numerous cities and tribes, yeah. And the term open access has come up a bit today. That's kind of your jam, right? But really, open access is fundamentally about public-private partnerships, yeah?
100%.
Yeah, so help us understand like where open access network fits in this whole discussion about public-private partnerships.
Well, one, you probably got to figure out what the true definition is of what you're interpreting open access to be, right? I think, Elliot, you were hitting on that in your fireside chat. Some people think open access is there's an owner, which could be the public entity, and then there's someone, operating it for them. And we think open access is when the community actually has choice, right? So that public entity is, wholesaling out the service, if you will, and in many cases partnering with the private sector and delivering services, and the community is getting choice. But again, it comes in a lot of different flavors, and every community is different. There's different stakeholders that want different things, so it's always about trying to figure it out, right? What makes sense? Roger and them have been doing it probably the longest in the States. A lot of ISPs on the network. There's a whole process of, well, when's it make sense to go from 2 ISPs to 3, right? You've got to think about the whole stack. It's got to work for everybody, right? So there's a lot of pieces that obviously go into it, but I love open access in the essence of an area that the public is wanting to do something about the gap because the incumbents aren't, and they get very fearful about going at it completely on their own. And open access is a way to, quite frankly, partner with the private side of the business to hopefully alleviate some of that and to bring competition into the area. We like to work with public entities that want to have some type of control of their digital future, and they can do that in a lot of different ways. But at the end of the day, that control is the ownership of the asset. How they operate it, vertically integrated, this, that, next thing. Lots of important things to think through that, but that's the fundamental start, that they own it, right?
And when you're when you're thinking about those things, like I'm interested to hear about how you think about risk management as it relates to building these networks, open access in particular. But talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, if we're talking from a financial perspective, they would rather have open access be single tenant, and the single tenant pay a fee to be on that network. AT&T is obviously doing it on a bunch of networks. And that helps, right? That alleviates some risk to the financial side of the house if they're bringing bonds or tax-free bonds, something like that. But if you really want to reduce risk for that public entity, it's actually allowing multiple providers on that network, right, to compete with each other. Because if something happens, as long as the underlying asset is providing the reliability it needs to do, right, for those service providers to properly compete, then the public side's going to lower risk, because if someone leaves that ISP, they're going to still likely stay on the network. If that community's been doing the right education, to educate them on the high-speed capacity of that fiber network. So if they leave ISP A and go to B, and they're both still on that same network, they're benefiting from not getting impacted by that churn. That's one level of reducing risk, right? Another way to reduce risk is also to have more than one entity competing for the end user, right? I mean, I love talking to the ISPs on Utopia's network, because one of the things I asked them, I said, wow, do you guys just compete with each other? And they're like, no, we all compete against the incumbent. We don't compete against each other. because we don't have much value over each other. We're doing fiber. Some provide additional services than the other, but most importantly, they're competing against the high cost, low reliability of the inferior network, right? And so it's not a race to the bottom of pricing. It's just, quite frankly, that doesn't exist. We haven't seen it.
Now, it's interesting. Now, and now I want to open it up for everybody on the panel, just to kind of jump in and talk. But, you know, we like to think about public-private partnerships like the ideal one is where the local community owns the infrastructure. But how many, I guess what I'm trying to get to is, how do you think about making that attractive to private ISPs to want to enter into that kind of relationship and not have ownership of the infrastructure? And how many ISPs in an open access situation, how many ISPs really can operate on that network? And I don't mean technically speaking, but like, give us a sense of that landscape. How many, if you're going into this thinking, you know, we want to, you know, public-private partnerships are very attractive, but we want to own the infrastructure. Let's build an open access network. But how do communities think properly about doing it in such a way that can attract that scenario where people have a choice of various providers on that network?
It starts with basics. It's the pro forma. It's the understanding the pro forma for every single slice, right? It's like what Elliot said. It's like, here's what you need to understand, and I'm sharing it so we can all work together, right? And when you share that type of information, you understand what they need to be able to make on that service too. That's a key component. But a lot of it is also the definition of where each entity plays, right? What's their, pardon the pun, demarcation point, right? When do the responsibilities stop and the other one picks up? So all that has to be very, very clear, both in expectations and contractually, but it's really understanding, well, what are the basic pieces for that ISP to come to my network? How much is it going to cost them to connect to me, to get backhaul? The first connection might not have resiliency. When can they pay for the second one? Right, to second connection to have resiliency. There's all these finite things that you have to think through, and it takes time to actually get there. So, you know, you wouldn't ever start, in my opinion, an open access network with 3 providers. You might just start it with 1, get the bugs worked out between, you know, the asset owner, in some cases, operator and ISP, right? There's 3 entities. Maybe there's a point of working through that. Maybe you're starting with just 2. So you're still delivering on choice. And then you're going to build up to a point where you understand their pro forma, and when you think you need to add that third. Because let's face it, being able to have the ability to choose from 2 fiber providers in your area is already nirvana. We don't need to put tons of ISPs on the network until you have mass, you know, like Utopia, right? It's a very different situation. Yeah. You have to think of that starting point, right? Yeah. Because that ISP has to be successful. Mm-hmm. You have to make sure that they're going to be a part of this, right? We started our first one on a reservation. It is a checkerboard reservation, so that means that there's also privately owned property within the boundaries. And we started with 2 ISPs. One, it was an ILEC that had been around over 100 years, Farmers Tell. And another one is X-Mission, who's on Utopia and pure virtual ISP. And both are doing really well, but both have a completely different way of serving the client, right? One wants white glove, goes actually in on the installation with our technician because we install the network, and we'll do the router installation for the ISP. And the other one has, I don't think, yet to step on the reservation. It's up to install the first switch and relying on our local technicians. So it just depends how the model works.
Now, Elliot, I'm really interested to hear your response to this.
Be nice, Elliot.
Well, I want to start with, I love that X-Mission is on one of those networks. They were a Two Cows mirror in the 90s. They were a domains reseller in the aughts. And so, old ISPs are thriving. I'd just love to hear it. Look, I just think today it's very hard to find ISPs who are willing to ride a network. I think that, for me, I was just straight earlier when answering the question on the panel, it's like I know of 2 networks that I would call open access, Utopia and Eamon. That's all I know. You know, you've talked about 2. I think that's great that you've got a second there. You know, I think it's expository that, you know, you guys have to use Utopia as an example as well. You know,
I'm only saying that because Roger's here.
yeah. Okay. So you know, if I was on that side and I was trying to cultivate them, I would look at web hosting companies in my footprint. I love, like, I mean, the fact that you had a local step up or there was a small local LEC, that's exactly the right place to start. You know, are there web hosting companies in the footprint? Are there small IT shops in the footprint? Because you need that small local reseller if you're going to create what is truly an open access ISP. But for most of them, they'll be standing up a new service unless they happen to be an ISP 15 years ago and sort of got out of it, as we all did from the dial-up days. So I just think it's a hard go right now.
Because it's not all that attractive if you're splitting a small pie and, you know, a bunch of different pieces. I don't know, Jessica, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Christa was saying. I think that one of the things that we're seeing that the Vermont CUD Association is doing, which I think is great. Well, they're looking to do. They're kind of experimenting and putting out their feelers right now, but that's a flexible loan fund. So they're looking at how can they, and here I am talking about your program. Sorry, I hope that's all right. But I think it's a great idea, and maybe you'll get some more interest here. But, you know, they're looking at creating a way to put out some smaller loans for, you know, bridge loans, construction loans, equipment loans. I think that we definitely need more things like that. And I think it was masterful that they were using our, interest that was generated from ARPA funds in order to do this. So I think that's great. But I think that looking at smaller ways to fund, and I'm kind of word salad here, but I think you made a great point, Christa, about urban versus rural networks. So I think the funding mechanisms that both of them need and the funding pots that both of them need are really different. So I think things like your flexible loan fund work perfect for what you're trying to accomplish. You know, how can we help these smaller communities? I think that's great.
Thanks. And I think that when you're in that rural area, you really need to have that municipal network, because otherwise you don't have any competition. You'll never have any competition. Nobody's going to go in and build fiber, especially if somebody's gone in and built it with grant funds. And that means when you do have that municipal network, we bring that money in, we reinvest it into the network, we reinvest it into accessibility, and then we reinvest it in lowering prices, either for income-sensitive folks or in general.
There's one point that I really want to, that rural distinction is useful when it's layered on with income, because the needs of the lower income rural communities completely mirror the lower income urban communities. They are the same problem. One of them gets a ton of money and the other gets none. And I've seen a ton of money, and I'm sure people in the room who touch this have seen it as well. And this is not what's going on in your situation, but where there's a ton of subsidy money that goes to wealthy rural locations. And that to me is just such a misuse of public funds.
Thank you. Now, one thing I do want to throw out to the panel is communities that are sort of in the process of thinking about, okay, we need to build this infrastructure. We would like to do it with a partner, or a private partner. But we've seen instances where, and I can't think of the name of the community in Florida where this happened, but where you get into this arrangement, but the partner doesn't end up building out to everyone in the community. How do you think about dealing with those kind of things ahead of time, where not only where they'll build out to the entire community, but also willing to offer a low cost option, which is obviously a big piece of that. I'd be interested to hear the panel talk about, because I think that ubiquitous connectivity is what communities are really after.
You know, Sean, I think definitionally you didn't describe a partnership. You described a city letting a private company come in, put in all the capital, build the infrastructure, and run the ISP. So to me, that's not a public-private partnership, right? I draw my line with who owns the infrastructure. So just me, definitionally.
Yep. Nope. That's a good distinction.
Because in that public setting, I mean, they are responsible for building to everyone, and they're responsible for managing whoever they've hired this work out to, right? An aspect what we see a lot on the private side is that they want companies like ours to do an all-in-one price, right? Because it's easy for the guys on the spreadsheets, no offense, Eric, to say, okay, great, that lowers my risk. But it's BS. I mean, if the cost is going to be the cost, that contractor is going to have to find a way to get out, right? And the bonding is a total joke as well. I have not seen one of these bonds ever come to fruition when they've been broken. There's just too many variables to lean on for them to not, be able to be a tool for the muni to really get them through. There's just so many variables that you can't lock down. So I think on the last panel, I think it was Roger that said, it's like, you've got to have folks on your team that understand this stuff, right? And you can still outsource, but someone has to be a responsible party for the public side and know some of this work. Because you can't, we can do a lot, but we can't do everything. We need a strong leader on the public side.
And really good comms, because I was thinking about what Digital C said about, put the residents in front. That's the story. You are not connecting this person. You are not connecting that person. Just a thought. Use them as the shields.
But the public is in the best place to serve everyone.
Absolutely.
The cost basis on financing is so dramatically different for the public than the private side. The private sector they're not bad people. They just have a business case to work within, and they build to whoever they can. And quite frankly, the rich also don't get built to. If they have big yards, we don't build to them.
The paradox of the 75-foot frontage, I call it.
Thank you. Because we can't charge them more. The model doesn't work like that. Right? So they don't get built either until one of them steps up and funds the difference, which happens a lot.
I just emphasize the separation of building the infrastructure and operating the infrastructure, and having the folks in-house and that you consult with that are not in the same group, And I appreciate that people offer all of those pieces, but you're better off having one entity or the internal piece. I mean, we've brought our construction management inside, our inspection inside, because we're planning for the future and planning for what we're going to do next as an entity. Just don't bring them together. It's like having the fox in the hen house.
I mean, I actually have a few more questions, but we do have a few minutes left, and I do want to see if there's anybody in the audience that may have a question. Jennifer, is there?
My name's Jennifer Redmond. I'm from Community Broadband PDX in Portland, Oregon. My question is about local regulatory impact with regards to public and private partnerships. Are you seeing anything around things like net neutrality, throttling, contracts, all of those things that kind of make private entities often very difficult to deal with and not helpful to public, helpful to municipalities? So does that question make sense that I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, I'm going to say, the short answer is no. And when I say not seeing it, that it's just not part of the dialogue like it used to be. If you're interested in those, and by the way, you're speaking to somebody who led with those things and nobody cared. So, we kind of stopped. By the way, and the places that did care were the exact places that would have 6 different processes and never get to the finish line. So there was, seriously, I could, it's, and so that is something, particularly in a community like Portland, where if you are going to be lucky enough to own your own infrastructure, good enough to own your own infrastructure, that you should, sort of make part of the dialogue with an ISP, absolutely. But you have to sort of initiate that. But
I would agree. I don't think it's really on fiber networks. We don't really see that as a problem. It's just not a part of the conversation. But in open access, when we're vetting ISPs, we absolutely care about the capacity of their networks, right? Understand if they do have anything like that in their TNCs, which we don't allow. But most of them, it's only the big guys that care about that.
Did you want to add anything?
I agree.
Oh, Drew.
Hey, Drew Clark, Broadband Breakfast. Great discussion, Frank. I still want to just
there's no Frank on the panel.
Frank Elliot and Frank Bryan. So and Jennifer too, and Christa. So where do you come down? End of the day, open access, 2, 3, none. I mean, like I understand where you're coming from, Elliot, right? And you're like the person who's done it and done it and done it, and now you're not doing it, right? So
No, that's not right. I love open access networks. Our experience is that we don't see ISPs who are interested in them. And remember that that's now an ISP who is service provider without owning the infrastructure, right? So we don't see ISPs that are interested in that because all of fiber is so expensive and has such long payback periods. So it requires lots of capital. The people who are putting capital up are overwhelmingly not people who will also act on open access as ISPs on open access networks. So
let me just reframe the question.
Yeah.
If cities are going to play a role in this place, the kind of premise of the discussion, and cities are the owners, then how many providers should we have on a city-owned network? That's the question I'd love everyone to say.
You use the should word, right? I mean, you
Will.
should.
How many will there be?
I think they're lucky. I think they should have one before they spend a nickel.
Okay.
And then they're lucky if they have any
Well,
more.
let's hear what others say.
I think you should start with 2. If you're talking about true open access and giving folks choice, you should start with 2, right? And then let that grow and see where it goes. Every one of these deployments is different, right? Different stakeholders, different needs. What worked on that reservation, is not going to work in a place like West Hollywood that we're working on open access as well. There'll be multiple providers on the network, and in that situation, they're going to focus on segments. It's different. That's what the stakeholders wanted. They want someone focused on MDUs because the majority of it's MDUs, and a lot of ISPs aren't that good with MDUs. Right? So it's different. It just depends. And a lot of it is we are here to consult, but we're also here to hear the city's wishes and help make it come true, not just fight them on each piece that we don't believe in. Our job is we believe every American deserves affordable broadband, right? Because it makes our lives better. Our job is to help see that community to that wish. And it may be open access, it might not be.
I think it absolutely depends on the structure. If you have a structure in which you're expecting somebody else to pay for the infrastructure and you don't have a revenue source and it's going to have to be maintained, you are going to need one fundamental, committed, long-term entity. But if you've got a structure like the CUDs, like Ellie and I have, where you are bringing in income, you are able to maintain, repair, build again, expand your network, then you have to make that decision based on what potential revenue sources come in and what that competes with.
Yeah, and I would just say I agree with Christa for the most part. I think start with one, for God's sakes, get at least one in, depending on the business model and what you've had and what services and speeds are. But, I'm always telling cities and municipalities that I work with, it's it's also, yes, there's this business model, but as we've all alluded to, what are your capabilities? What are your capacities? What can you do? What other stuff is coming down the pike? What other things do you want to put on this network? If you've got extra fiber, if you've got a lot of other things you're going to be doing besides internet, you're going to have a lot of things vying for your attention. So how, what's the best way for you to use your time too?
Does somebody else want to ask a question? Because I've got a question for Jessica.
Okay, good. Any other folks? There is one back there.
Yeah, go ahead. Let them ask.
Yep.
I'll wait.
Sort of a comment, but also a question. I can't count how many panels I have watched over the years where a conversation about public-private partnerships turned into a debate about open access. And Elliot's been on a lot of those panels. And we've been having this conversation since the very early 2000s, and it's still the same conversation, and we've got two, or if you want to be generous, maybe a handful of open access networks functioning with a municipal involvement in the United States. And they're phenomenal networks. They've accomplished extraordinary things. They're heroes. But it's clearly not a model that is scaling. Why are we talking about open access so much instead of talking about the public policy goals and the best ways economically to get to our public policy goals? Because I think open access has turned into a public policy goal because it feels so right. It sounds intuitively so right, like it should be right. But is it really the goal that we should have, or is it just another tactic that should be considered as part of a broader analysis? And I would ask you, I guess that's my question. Please tell me, is open access the end in and of itself? Because I worry that it's a very large distraction.
It's a great question, and before the panel answers, let me just say that yes, Utopia, Ammon, but let's not forget the open access networks in the state of Washington and the PUDs. Just to throw that out there. But go ahead. The public utility districts in Washington.
I don't know. I'll check. I'll get with Chris afterwards. I love to learn about everyone I could. I want to make something clear. If you listen to what I said I love open access. I said I wish the whole country was an open access network. Talking about what the city wants, to me, is interesting. If a city can find 2 ISPs, I think that's fantastic. If a city can find 3, I think that's fantastic. I am for that. My point is I don't think most can. And that's a very separate point. I'll be watching West Hollywood very closely because I love that and I want that to work, but let's.
Yeah, I think to your point, the bigger challenge and issue is how much control does the public want of their digital future, right? And then how do they get there? Open access is one scenario, right? I'm in Denver, Colorado. Next Light's right up the road. Very successful, Muni-owned, vertically integrated ISP. 65% penetration, paid off their bonds early, right? There's a lot of ways to skin the cat. It's probably not an appropriate thing to say right now, I'm sorry. But it's really about how do you get there? In my, you're an ISP, Elliot, so maybe the other ISPs aren't talking to you. Getting the ISPs is the easy part, quite frankly. I mean, from our perspective, the hard part is getting it.
You guys are all proving Joanne's point. Like, so hard right now. Yeah. So hard.
No, but it's the front side of it all, putting it all together, right? It can be one or many, but it's the financing. How are we going to move it forward? Do we have strong leadership in the community that wants to take on this long-term battle? On average, we've seen it take at least 3 years before we even get to move forward, right? That's just working through the front end. So you've got to have long-term tenacity to make this work in the public sector. And that's why it's just one of the things that we do. We help private overbuilders as well. We could never survive alone on this, but like Elliot, we believe in it because it is the only option in some areas to consider.
Yeah, I just want to say plus 100 to Joanne. We got to keep the eyes on the prize. and not get distracted.
Amen.
Anyway, but I had actually a question for Jessica because, you mentioned very briefly your experience with lit communities. And 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, lit communities was that was the bomb. Well, what happened?
Oh, no.
You bombed. But what happened? What did you
A
guys?
bomb.
No, seriously. I mean, where did things go wrong?
I think that we started with an idea of doing public-private partnerships with communities, helping communities identify funding sources, being able to help them build out feasibility studies to show them that it was possible, helping them find the funding, and then bringing in our own funding on top of that. I think that, we went through a couple. First of all, I will say, I think that we should have stayed with that model because I think that I would have been able to be sitting here today and probably have more to share with you. A couple of private rounds of investment later, we ended up with a very different business model. It was difficult for us to find additional funding to take us beyond maybe 1 or 2 markets. So we were very successful in Brownsville, Texas. I think many of us have heard about Brownsville. It's an incredibly growing and vibrant community right now that I still have very good connections and contacts with. And we were able to go in, do a feasibility study, help them build out a middle mile. That was with ARPA again. That's like the second or third time we've heard that. But I think that going forward, and then there was another community in Ohio that we were able to do that very successfully with, but those really depended on good sources of income, really good partners like the city of Brownsville or the Medina County Fiber Network in Medina that was already a vibrant city network that was already up and running. And I think that it got very hard it got really hard to construct them, Gigi. It got really hard to do the execution piece for this team. So networks are hard. I mean, if it was easy, everybody'd be doing it, right? So it got really tough. Second round of investment changed the model. So we were asked to deprioritize the P3 greatly. I don't know if I answered your question, but okay.
Yeah, we just have a few minutes left, and I'm glad that you made that point. By the way, Brownsville, if I remember correctly, one thing that I remember interesting about that was that demo center that was put there for the community, and I thought that was just an interesting way to expose what that network could do, and it really was a difference maker.
And
there.
I think that they're taking, just really quickly, I think what Brownsville is doing now is they are taking much more of an ownership stance in the middle mile network that they're building. So when I was kind of making my notes for this panel, I was thinking about Brownsville is really the golden child for P3s because what they've done now is that they have this wonderful, amazing, built-out bi-lit communities middle mile network, and they're able to take this now and attract probably 2 or 3 more last mile providers. They want to do a wireless network. They're bringing in, smart city sensors. They're talking about building laterals. I mean, they're in the driver's seat with this thing. Now, I know that they're kind of an exception, but I kind of look at them as over here. And then there's other communities that we work with that are at various stages. So, Jeff Sabaka, who's on my team, raise your hand, Jeff, right there. He and I and another colleague of ours, Amanda Barrett, and thank you, Gigi, for being at Amanda's thing. We're always looking for ways to try to create more value for all of these networks that our communities are engaged in. So whether that's expanding it out, additional counties, more network, more laterals, more fiber, or in Jeff's case, putting a wireless network on top of a community in Yuma County, Arizona. So a lot.
Well, I want to thank each of our panelists.
2 more questions.
Oh, we do.
We'll
that's
go to 3:25 and then we'll take a 15-minute break.
Okay.
Got you.
so
Excellent.
nice to make the room. Danny Fuchs with HR & Day, friend of Joanne's. Want to talk about the public policy purpose. Speaking to a lot of my clients in cities, their focus is about affordability for consumers. Can you talk about how it is that the projects you work on, your model, works towards delivering affordability to consumers? Because these places are focused on broadband, frankly, in some respects, as a challenge of poverty more than a challenge of infrastructure.
I'll start. We've got the poorest area in Vermont, so affordability is just one of our absolute top pieces. And one of the things that I was going to say earlier is like every partnership has a purpose and a time. And depending on the cost of that partnership, there may be a time where either your partner needs to make a little less money, maybe you've got a lot more customers, or you need to find a different way to do it. Because there's only so far you can go down if you're paying somebody else and they're making that profit. That profit in that public-private partnership, if you set up and have your own ISP, which you can do, that profit then goes to the people. So, you know, our long-term goal is either to drive those costs down in partnership with the ISP or to drive those costs down independent of the ISP. And you only have that ability if you control the infrastructure and if you've set your contracts up so that you have options. Not every public-private partnership is going to be a success. You need to know how to get out.
Yeah, there's a couple elements there that I'd highlight. First of all, with ACP gone and will not come back, it's a much bigger challenge than it was. You know, I've been pushing in a few different contexts for USF reform being a solution here. I don't think that's going to happen either. So, you know, people are on their own. The first thing is, to the extent, you know, the way that you can most effectively address it, building in any footprint, is to make sure, you know, assuming it's mixed income at this point, that there is enough money to be made on the middle and upper income that you can make a reasonable ask of your ISP in the lower income places. Now, I don't know anybody else who's doing what we do in this regard, so I can't speak to it, but, you know, maybe in all these open access networks with all these thousands of ISPs, they have great examples of it. But, you know, what we're doing in a big city is we're working with a very active local community organization. So we have downloaded to them the challenges in lower income households of qualification, which used to be easy with ACP, right? Here's an API, I can query it, you qualify, right? That's a very expensive thing for us to do. So community partner around qualification, and then a community partner around non-standard payments. So we're offering 2 rates where they qualify to an accepted standard. We are doing it for, you know, something that's probably pretty close to our cost to maintain. But that requires a very active, competent local partner. We're speaking to the same network owner in a different footprint. They want to roll the same thing out, but there's not a great local partner there. It's a challenge, right? So the city needs to show up, or a local community needs to be active enough, in our view, to get anywhere there. But I will tell you that the solutions they don't exist today to solve that specific problem you're talking about. And what I'm describing is an experiment. I really hope it works. I really hope that, you know, I can come back here in a year and there's a lot of coverage of that and people can model that stuff elsewhere. But right now it's hard. So that's an experiment, you know, something we hope will work.
Let's see. I'm sorry. I just want to see if we can get that. There's one last question before we get the yanked off the stage.
Yeah, just a comment more than a question. But what I've often seen, Greg Laudeman with Eduity, what I've often seen with public-private partnerships is that the public and the private have very different ideas about what partnerships are. And particularly on the public side, there's a huge disconnect between the goals of just providing broadband and the overall strategic priorities for the community. So like economic development plans that totally require ubiquitous connectivity that never mention anything about telecom or anything. So just thoughts from the panel about how we close this leadership divide. I mean, I see tech leadership as one of the biggest issues we're dealing with, or the lack thereof. So just curious if you guys have thoughts about how we get leaders to better understand how this all aligns and how it can really benefit their communities, because I see that as a great way to drive these partnerships forward.
Well, I'll just answer super quick. I think every community has their challenge, right? So some communities it's healthcare, some communities it's education. Unfortunately, there's some communities that have it all as a challenge. But I think it's finding, in terms of being able to provide education and support, you have to find what gets them, the get them. So is the get them the education piece or the healthcare piece, and then educating through whatever the challenging piece is for them. I always look for the pain point and go in there.
I think also we as technologists overcomplicate it for the public, and it should go right back to that. That's why we're doing this. It's remote job opportunities, education, remote healthcare. All of these things help to create a more vibrant community, and quite frankly, from a healthcare perspective, it only saves us money down the road, right, if we can do more preventative healthcare. For some reason, there's just a gap in that understanding, and I think we overthink it. I know I overthink a lot of stuff, and we just got to keep it simple. Those are the three things we're fighting for, and every American deserves it.
Christa, a quick response, and then we can...
I think when we think about public-private partnerships, you may have the main one, but there are so many more out there, like our relationship with the Community Action Agency, like the ISPs that you can work with to be a part of your network, even if they're not providing services, that they're taking the underlying wholesale. So let's not maintain one private-public partnership. Let's find a variety of them, because that's how we bring the leadership to the table from the tech perspective, is that we stop thinking about this as an infrastructure build and we start thinking about all of the levels of what this opportunity is going to provide.
Excellent. Great way to end it. Thank you very much, everyone.